to yet another video on Springboot interview question series. Whether you are a fresher, whether you are an experienced, no matter what's your level of experience, you will be always tested to check out whether you have already worked on Springboot or not. This is one of the hot technologies which is used in the IT world. So, interview will definitely ask questions to understand whether you have already worked on it. Let's get started. The very first question when it comes to Spring Boot, right? What they will expect, what is the reason we have shifted to use Spring Boot, right, instead of any other framework. So we try to understand what are these good four features and what is the benefit which made you to shift to Spring Boot application, Spring Boot. So let's get started. So Spring Boot is a powerful framework built on top of the Spring framework that simplifies the development of standalone production-ready application. Uh, its core features are like uh, it's an auto configuration. So automatically configure Spring based on dependencies and settings. So when you define the dependencies in your XML, it will automatically configure whatever it is there in the class path. It will automatically configure it. Whether you are defining any data source, it will configure all the dependencies required in it. It will just check like based on the condition whether it is like the certain dependencies or certain information is already available in the class path. You define those dependencies, it will automatically configure things. If there is an embedded server, it doesn't need to they separated deploy it. So it includes an embedded server like Tomcat or Jetty for easy deployment. So we can choose by default the Tomcat is an default one, but we can actually exclude the Tomcat and then we can include the Jetty. So there is we can define it in the pom.xml. Starter dependencies. So it provide a pre-configured dependencies for a common functionality. Let's say you are defining a web as a dependency. So all the dependencies and it's all related dependencies will be added in there. So you doesn't need to explicitly define, just defining the web starter dependency will include everything as part of it. Certainly it is applicable for all other dependencies, whether it is Spring Data JPA, whether it is Lombok, whether it is any other integration we are using it. Convention over configuration reduces the boilerplate code and simplify the configuration. So it comes as an handy, right, where you reduce the boilerplate code and just focus on your functionality by achievement. So it's quite supports in that particular Spring Boot, quite helps in that. So Actuator, so it's offer a production ready features for monitoring and management. So there are certain endpoints which are exposed in the Actuator. So there are matrices, there are health checkups, there are different endpoints which is exposed to understand like how we can monitor this. So what are the benefits? Let's look at the Spring Boot benefits. So uh, it has made quite faster, helpful for the developer to make the life cycle of build deploy cycle, right? So it is quite easy to develop and it's quite fast to develop and deploy the applications. It is one of the important and the main reason for choosing Spring Boot. Then there is a reduced configuration over there. As we already spoke about, once you define the dependencies, all the dependencies and configuration, you doesn't need to take care of Spring Boot. You will actually take care internally with your configuration, with the annotation at the Spring Boot application. Improved productivity. So when you have this particular let's overhead and then there's a faster deployment, automatically the development team's efficiency and productivity goes high, right? So it result in the developer focuses on the actual business logic instead of writing the boilerplate codes where it spends endless time. So better testability when you're dealing with any application, right? How well that can be tested is most important. So Spring Boot provide a quite well support to writing and testing. So the component whatever we have written, so it provide quite a little support, quite more support to test the applications. So production ready applications. So but whenever we have an applications which we for the production ready, we have this particular, with the help of Spring Boot, right? We can make that grade of applications. Let's look at the question number 2. Explain the concept of Spring Boot starter dependency, how they simplify the development. So we wanted to understand what is the Spring Boot starter dependencies and how it will simplify the development. So what is, as I explained, Spring Boot dependencies are a prepackaged dependency that provide essential components for a specific functionality. So how they deploy, how they simplify the development by it will reduce your need to manually include the dependency. Earlier in Spring, right, we used to manually define each dependencies with their specific version. Now introducing with the starter, we doesn't have to deal with the dependencies and their versions. Spring Boot will automatically take care of that part, ensuring the consistent versioning of the deployment. So it might happens like where when you're defining certain, using certain version, right? So one is compatible or where one is deprecated. So it provide a consistency over there where it the versioning, you doesn't need to take care of that, it is automatically been taken care by Spring Boot application to provide a pre-configured settings for a common use case. So the configuration is already provided for a common use cases. Now let's look at the example. So let's say when we take about an example of web, right? So there is a starter dependency, we can add it. So when we're dealing with the web application, whether it's Spring MVC, Tomcat, Jackson, all the dependencies will be already included in it. Let's look at the another example. Springboot Data JPA. So when you're dealing with a data layer, right? So we can include the data dependencies like JPA based data accesses, like when you're dealing with Hibernate or Spring Data JPA, etc. All the dependencies will be added automatically. Let's look at the question number 3. How does Spring Boot achieve auto configuration? Explain the role of Spring Boot application and enable auto configuration. So the main annotation when it comes to Spring Boot application, when you're defining when you're creating a Spring Boot application, this is one of the important annotation at the Spring Boot application. It actually composes of certain another uh, internal annotations which actually automatically being run up. So auto configuration relies on a conditional configuration. So based on the condition and the component scanning which are available in the class path, those configurations are defined and added. So at the rate, Spring Boot application annotation is composed, it includes the different annotations. One is at the rate component scan. So it all scans all the components, all the configuration, all the services in the application wherever it is written. So it scans everything, and then uh, it makes use of it. Then it configures, and then there is an at the rate enable auto configuration. So it enables the in the class but whatever setting has been mentioned, whatever configuration details as mentioned, it automatically configure based on that. So enable auto configuration triggers the auto configuration process where Spring Boot attempts to configure being based on the available classes and the properties. Whatever you define the classes, whatever the properties has been defined in the class path, right? Based on that, the configuration is taken care by the Spring Boot. Let's look at the fourth question. What is Spring Data JPA? How does it simplifies the data access in Spring Boot application? Uh, Whenever you are creating an application, there is always a, trying to connect to a database with the data layer, right? So we make there are different ways that we can connect. The Spring Data JPA is one way where we can connect to a database. So there is a layer. So let's look at it. So it's a part of the Spring Data family that provide a repository abstraction layer of the JPA. So it is one another level on top of JPA. So JPA is nothing but a specification, whereas Spring Data JPA provide another level of an abstraction over here, but it actually provide us simplifies the data access. So what it does is that it provide a repository interface. So there are different interfaces. It shows like there are CRUD repository methods which are available, then automatically generating the implementation based on the entity class. So if you define an entity class which is mapped to a certain table, so the automatic implementation is already taken care by Spring Data JPA. So you doesn't need to write a complex queries or deal with certain default save update. So automatically it will be taken care when you run this particular. So we can define certain queries, complex custom queries as well. So we provide a mechanism where you can define those particular query methods. Integration with transaction management. So Spring Boot providing quite well support for transaction. We can define propagation level and isolation levels. So we can easily integrate with that when it comes to Spring Data JPA and dealing with consistency, atomicity. Question number 5. Explain different ways to handle exception in Spring Boot application. So how well your exception handling has been written, denotes like how your application has been written and how well it is maintained. So if you're not dealing with the exception handling and you're not handling your request properly, there might be a problem. So interviewer would like to know like how you have handled any if there is certain unhandled use cases or certain error or exception handling. How do you achieve that in Spring Boot? So Spring Boot provides several mechanisms to handle exception. One way is right, you have to define at the rate controller advice. So it's a global way of handling your exception throughout your controllers. Whenever any exception is there in the controller, the at the rate controller will take care of if there is certain exception happening. We can make use of at the rate exception handler. So we can define certain specific exception within the controller. Let's say the null pointer exception, or let's say any other exception which we can try and define, and then we can throw that exception. It will take care by the exception handler. You can define different resource statuses. So if there is an exception, if the server is not available, there is a 500. There is if there is certain other if the resource is not available, the request is bad. You can define the port series. There are different status codes. We can define whether let's say it's a success or whether it's a failure. We can define those particular HTTP status code to denote what kind of, whether it has succeeded or whether it has failed. Whether it has failed, like what kind of exception it is. Error controller. So we can define a custom error page. Let's look at the sixth question. How do you secure your Spring Boot application using Spring Security? So this is one of the important questions. No matter like whether you are experienced or fresher, they will try to understand. Have you taken part in securing your Spring Boot application? What control or measures you have taken to what all tools have you used for making your application secure? So Spring Security is yet a powerful framework for securing a Spring application. Key features to secure a Spring include application includes you need to define the dependency. The first step is like in the pom.xml, you have to define the starter dependency which is respect to the Spring securities. Then you have to define and configure the authentication in the authorization mechanism. So we can make use of in-memory, we can make use of database, LDAP mechanisms to provide this authentication authorization. You can define user roles and permission as well. So based on the roles and different, we can define the security. We protect the endpoints using the annotation. We can make use of pre-authorized or address secure for securing the endpoints. So there is, we can actually add the additional security using CSRF protection, and in the HTTP header also and auditing we can define those. Let's look at the seventh question. What are the Spring Boot actual endpoints? How they can be used for monitoring and management? So, as I earlier spoke to, so Spring Boot Actuator provide a production-ready features for monitoring and managing the application. So it exposes certain endpoints, like the what is the health of the application, what are the matrices, what kind of environment, more information. So common endpoints, just have a look at it. One is /health. So it checks the application health. Matrices, it checks for like what are the expo metrics has been exposed in the application, right? Environment display the configuration properties related based on the environment. There is info, provide application related informations. Shutdown. So safely shut down the application with the proper configuration. You can define those. Explain different ways to profile a Spring Boot application. Now, when it comes to profiling your application, right? So there are built-in matrices. So Actuator endpoints to check the there is an endpoint for matrices to collect the matrices details. We have logging. So we can define like different levels of logging: import, debug, error, and we can make use logging framework for analysis for what went wrong, what where is the exactly issue. Profiling tools, we can make use of different profiling tools like Visual VM or URKit to analyze the performance. There are different other bunch of providers we can make use of for to understand the performance. Spring Boot Actuator endpoints. So utilize the endpoints like matrices, traces for performing the insights. So get more details about what is happening in the what's wrong with the application. Let's look at the question number 9. How do you deploy the Spring Boot application to a production? The interviewer would definitely like to understand once the development is complete, how do you deal with the deployment? Who does the deployment? Whether you are aware of the steps. So they will definitely try to understand, what are the steps involved in it, are you part of it. There are multiple ways to we can deploy this Spring Boot application to production. One way is in your application when we are dealing with Spring Boot, right? As I already mentioned, there is an embedded server, so we can deploy once you build that particular application with a jar or what, we can deploy it and automatically in that. So define in the properties format XML file. In the XML application server, so we can deploy that particular WAR file to any of this particular server like Tomcat or WebLogic. There are different cloud platforms where we can actually explicitly deploy this particular jar WAR files. There are different cloud platforms like AWS, Azure, and GCP. So explicitly we can deploy the WAR files or jar files over there. The containerization is one of the hot topics where scaling, defining like scaling certain uh, microservices or certain application when we're dealing. So packaging as a Docker image, and then we can deploy to container authorization platforms like Kubernetes, which will enable it to in the pods, so that it scales up whenever it is required, and we can configure those. What is the difference between @AutoWire and @inject annotation? So there are different annotations. Quite in Spring Boot application there are various annotations which we when we are doing the development we can make use of. So these are the two annotations which we make use of it. In one interview, we would like to understand what is the difference between them and when it is used in what context. So these both are used for dependency injection. So when we're trying to um, annotate or fulfill any dependency for any other object, right? We will make use of at the rate AutoWire and at the rate inject. But they have a different origin. So when it comes to AutoWire, right, comes from a Spring framework. So it provides more features like the qualifier, conditional injection. There you can define when it comes to the granular level we can define those. But when it comes to at the rate inject, it comes from the JSR specification P30. So specification and it's more general. So whereas at the rate Ottawa is more specific to a Spring, but at the rate inject is more specific to a Java and JSR things that is specification. So it's a general purpose annotation. What is the difference between what is an Spring Boot actuator? Explain its role in production monitoring. So it provides, as I said, production-ready features for monitoring and managing the Spring Boot application. Different endpoints are exposed, health matrices, environment. If you see, these are like for monitoring the health, gathering certain matrices like how it is performing, inspecting your configuration, what configurations are defined for a certain application. We need to audit certain application events. We can make use of Actuator. what is the concept of profile in Spring Boot? How are they used in different environments? So when we are dealing with different environments in a Spring, when we are making use of Spring Boot, right? Spring provides support for a different environment. We can define certain different configuration for different environment based on development, production, staging. So it will allow you to configure different setting for a different environment. Whether it's a development, whether it's a test environment, whether it's a production, you can use profiles. So how to do is that you have to activate that particular configuration property. Okay. So we can also make use it for excluding or including certain beans based on the certain profiles. We can actually define certain database configuration details. Let's say for the production there will be a different URL, username and password. For development we have different environment, and we make use of certain URL or machines different in our environment. We can modify the application behavior based on the profiles. Profiles are activated using in the application properties. We define Spring.profiles.active property, where we have to define what kind of environment we are making deal, and then based on the certain profile, your application will behave in certain way. How do you implement RESTful API using Spring Boot? Explain the role of @ controller, request method, response body. So there are, when you're dealing with any REST API, right? Spring Boot is one of the most preferred, and the developer. It's quite easy to develop. It provides a lot of support when you're dealing with REST API. It's quite handy. So that is the main reason when you're dealing with any REST API, Spring Boot provide a lot of support in that. So there are different annotations which we make use it when you're dealing with the REST API. So let's look at it. So it is quite easy to develop RESTful API. So @REST controller, it indicates that it's a REST controller. It's a stereotype where it denotes it's a REST endpoint, a REST controller. We are dealing with a REST controller. Now there is an request mapping. So whenever your request lands to an application in your application, right, it has to be mapped to a certain methods, HTTP methods. There are different HTTP methods. If you see get, post, put, delete, trace, there are different methods when based on your request header or request, it actually lands on the a certain methods where you define this particular mappings. Response body, it indicates that what method returns, right? So when a certain request is being handled, it is an intended to return certain response, right? So whether you're dealing with whether you wanted to respond as in JSON, whether you want to respond using XML or any error status, we can make use of this response body, and then we can actually uh, configure it. So let's look at the example how it is being a general purpose thing. If you see controller is defined, and then we have an request mapping. We have a certain endpoint defined. Let's look at the 14th question. What's the difference between component, service, repository, and the controller action? So uh, when you go for an interview, right? So this is one of the most commonly asked and the most frequently asked. So they would like to understand whether you have an understanding, deep dive understanding of Spring Boot. In what case component is, in what scenario we use service, in which layer we do you use it. Say we wanted to understand, do you have that particular knowledge on it. So these annotations are based on the different layers of an application. Let's look at it. So when it's a general purpose. If you see component, right, it's a very generic stereotype. So for any managed component, so it is used in the Spring Boot application. It's a general purpose one. But when it comes to service, it's specifically used for any business logic. So when you're defining any business logic at the service layer, right, there we annotate with the the class is annotated with that. So it actually denotes that this particular class is certainly has some business logic around it. At repository, it's a data layer. So when the class is annotated with certain at the rate repository, it denotes that it's dealing with the data layer, and it indicates that it's a repository at the rate controller. So when your request first lands, it goes to the controller, right? So indicate that some the request has been handled by certain controller with the different methods defined in it. So it denotes that it's a controller, and what kind of who will be handling your request. How do you handle asynchronous programming in Springboot? So when you're dealing with HTTP, it's a synchronous way of communication. So until you get that particular response, it will be kept blocked and you'll get a certain response. But there is also a way where we can actually asynchronously program and then achieve our functionality. There are some different use cases where we can asynchronously want us a functionality to be ramped up. So let's look at it how Spring Boot provides support for asynchronous programming. So if you see there is an at the rate async annotation. So when you're defining any of this particular method and you annotate it as synchron, so it denotes that we have certain functionality which has to be asynchronously be run, and then it will make use of certain different threads and the core of your application machine. So it will run in a different thread. So in order to enable your application to actually run the asynchronous process, we make use of at the rate enable async. So it will enable the behavior of your app. So without this, your async annotation will not work. But the task executor configure the thread pool for asynchronous. So we can define the task executor where we can define the pool for it. Let's look at the 16th question. Explain explain the Spring Boot approach for testing. What are the different types of tests you can write? So whenever you are when you're finished with your application development, you there are different ways of testing, right? So there are different. You must have heard of TDD. Uh, it's a mechanism where test-driven architecture, right? So where we first write the test cases and then implement that, right? So Spring Boot provide a quite well support for it. Whatever code of line you write in each application, right? Each component can be tested. So you will try to understand, like whether when you are writing any code, right, how you deal with testing that particular component. So it provide excellent support. So we can use unit testing. We can individually test the component in isolation. So it doesn't. It is quite handy to test it. Integration testing. We have different services communicating with each other, so we can make use of the testing where we can actually test how your one service or one component is interacting with any other. So we can do the integration test to understand whether your feature is achieved. Web test to test web endpoints. So we can actually make use of web test to test the endpoints of it. The Spring Boot offers test slices. There is a mock objects, a testing framework integration to facilitate testing. There are JUnit, Mockito, Power Mockito, which we can integrate. Spring can integrate and quite support it. How do you configure database connections in a Spring Boot application? So there are, when you are dealing with an data layer, right? We certainly if there is a requirement where we need to persist the data into a database, right? We are dealing with database, right? So we would like to know, like when you are dealing with Spring Boot, right? What are the configurations we require for database connections, right? So database configuration we all define it in the property files or either in the environment variable. So commonly include properties like URL, username and password. Then you can define the platform. You can make use of this automatically. So when you define these particular configurations in your application properties, it automatically configures the data source at the end based on the bean value you have defined. So remember the at the rate Spring Boot application annotation. Make use of this, based on the dependencies, it automatically configure those. What is the role of application with properties? So when you're dealing with an application property and when you're dealing with application.yml, these are actually kind of similar, but they are both intended to be different when it comes, like there's a structured difference. Like some uses application.property, some prefer application.yml based on like their preferences. But let's look at what is the difference between them. So these both are used for configuration. The application property has got a different syntax where it deals with an key value pair way of dealing with the property. So you'll have a certain key, for that you'll have a certain property or a value. But when it comes to application.yml, it is structured in a certain syntax. It is defined in a certain hierarchical manner. So it comes quite handy when you are dealing with repetitive prefixes, and then we have a certain different other postfixes where you have different attributes, but there is a prefix which is already repeating. So in that case, yml quite it comes in a quite handy. But when you're dealing with application property, it has got its own charm. Both files can be used for various settings such as database configuration, server ports, application properties. How do you implement caching in Spring Boot? So caching is one of the important features when you're dealing with heavy resource, or you want some certain features to be preloaded when your application gets started, and you at a certain a period you wanted to keep updating it, so that every time you doesn't hit the database, and then you just get the data from the cache whenever it is required, and then you update it whenever there is an update. So it's quite handy feature when you are dealing with large set of data or master data. You doesn't require to hit the database normally to get that data. So there is an cacheable annotation indicating that the method, whatever it is annotated with cacheable, it should be created, and then it should return certain that whatever that particular method returns, it is cacheable, so that whenever there is another time the particular same method is called, it actually looks into the cache whether this particular data has been already been asked. If it is not asked at the first time, then it will hit the database, and then whatever you have written the logic, it will serve that request. You make use of cacheable also to evict that particular cache values. You can make use of cache put. Let's say certain you have taken the first load of the particular data from anywhere, and then you dumped into the cache. But after a certain time there is an update, so we make a use of certainly the periodic time we need to update that particular cache using the cache put. Spring Boot provide integration with popular caching provider. There are different providers like Cache and Redis. So these are the most widely used and most preferred one. Explain the concept of dependency injection. So this is one of the important feature of Spring Boot. Spring. When you're dealing with dependencies of a different objects, we will make use of dependency injection features. So the design pattern which deals with relying on different objects or services to function. Spring Boot uses dependency injection to manage the life cycle, so in the relation between the objects. So at the rate annotation is commonly used in the inject dependencies into a beans. Thank you for watching.